The summer sun beat down on the courthouse steps as people rushed in and out, their faces showing a mix of worry, relief, and everything in between. It was just another busy Monday morning at the county courthouse, but for Judge Tamara Wilson, it was the start of what would become one of the most memorable cases of her career. Judge Wilson parked her modest sedan in her reserved spot, gathered her belongings, and walked through the back entrance of the courthouse. She nodded to the security guards who had known her for all 15 years she'd served on the bench. At 54, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of making tough decisions and standing by them. "Morning, Your Honor," said Bill, the veteran bailiff who had worked with her since her first day. "Got a full docket today." "Anything I should know about?" she asked, sipping her coffee. Bill hesitated. "That real estate guy is back. Thornton. Third time this year." Judge Wilson's expression didn't change, but she took a longer sip of her coffee. James Thornton. The name alone was enough to give the courthouse staff a collective headache. A 32-year-old real estate developer whose daddy's money had built half the luxury apartments in town, Thornton had a special talent for breaking rules and avoiding consequences. "What's he in for this time?" she asked, though she could probably guess. "Crashed his fancy sports car into the front of Lou's diner. Witnesses say he was doing at least 60 in a 30 zone. Just property damage, thankfully, but Lou's been serving folks in that spot for 30 years. Judge Wilson nodded and continued to their chambers. She remembered Lou's diner. She'd eaten their famous apple pie after her swearing-in ceremony. The thought of that community landmark damaged by someone's recklessness didn't sit well with her. Across town, in a penthouse apartment overlooking the river, James Thornton was getting ready for what he considered a minor inconvenience. His lawyer, a nervous man named Richard Walsh, had called 5 times already that morning. "It's just a traffic thing," Thornton told his girlfriend as he adjusted his designer tie. "I'll be back for lunch." "But isn't it the same judge as last time?" she asked, still lying in bed, scrolling through her phone. "The one you said was a hard ass." Thornton smirked. "Judge Wilson. Yeah, she likes to act tough, especially with guys like me. Probably has a chip on her shoulder. But Walsh says we can get this dismissed on a technicality." He grabbed his keys and wallet, checking his reflection one last time. At 6'2" with perfectly styled hair and a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, Thornton knew how to make an impression. He'd learned early in life that looking the part was half the battle, and for the other half, there was always money. By the time Thornton strolled into the courtroom, 15 minutes late, Judge Wilson was already working through her morning cases. His lawyer was sweating by the door, files clutched to his chest. "Nice of you to join us, Mr. Thornton," Judge Wilson said without looking up from her papers. The courtroom was crowded with other defendants, lawyers, and people waiting for their cases to be called. A few recognized Thornton and whispered to each other. "Traffic," Thornton replied with a smirk that suggested he found his own joke clever. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. As he took his seat beside his lawyer, Thornton spotted Lou, the diner owner, sitting in the back row. The old man's weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes never left Thornton. For a brief moment, something like shame flickered across Thornton's face, but he quickly buried it under his practiced confidence. Judge Wilson called the next case, and as the details of another matter filled the courtroom, Thornton leaned back in his chair, checking emails on his phone despite the signs forbidding it. He had no idea that by the end of this day, his life would change forever, all because he couldn't keep his mouth shut in front of the wrong judge. 2 hours passed in the courtroom before Judge Wilson finally called Thornton's case. During that time, he had checked his watch at least a dozen times, texted continuously despite the no phone signs, and whispered comments to his lawyer that made the attorney's face grow increasingly pale. Docket number 47,823, County versus James Thornton. Reckless driving resulting in property damage, the court clerk announced. Thornton sauntered to the defendant's table with the easy confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. His lawyer shuffled behind him, already looking defeated. Judge Wilson looked up from her notes and studied Thornton. This wasn't his first appearance in her courtroom. Last winter, it had been a noise violation at one of his properties where tenants had complained for months. Before that, a dispute with a contractor he'd refused to pay. Each time, he'd walked away with minimal penalties, and each time, his attitude had grown worse. "Mr. Thornton," Judge Wilson began, her voice clear and measured, "I see you're becoming a regular in my courtroom." A few chuckles rippled through the gallery. Thornton's mouth twitched into what might have been a smile on anyone else, but on him looked more like a sneer. "Lucky me," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. His lawyer closed his eyes briefly, as if praying for patience. From her elevated bench, Judge Wilson caught every nuance of his behavior. The way he leaned back casually while everyone else stood straight. The way his eyes wandered around the room instead of focusing on her. The barely concealed contempt in his posture. "Mr. Walsh," she addressed Thornton's lawyer, "your client's body language suggests he doesn't consider these proceedings important. Would you agree?" The lawyer straightened up immediately. "Your Honor, I assure you Mr. Thornton takes this very seriously. He's prepared to make full restitution for the damage to the diner." "Is that so?" Judge Wilson shifted her gaze back to Thornton. "Mr. Thornton, are you aware that Lou's Diner has been closed for 3 weeks due to the damage caused by your vehicle?" Thornton shrugged. "That's what insurance is for." In the back of the courtroom, Lou, the diner owner, shook his head slowly. Next to him sat his granddaughter, who had worked as a waitress at the diner to help pay for college. Without the diner's income, her tuition payment for the coming semester was now in jeopardy. "And are you aware," Judge Wilson continued, her tone unchanged despite Thornton's dismissive attitude, "that 12 people are currently without work because of the closure?" "Not my problem," Thornton replied, checking his expensive watch again. "I've got places to be, Your Honor. Can we move this along?" A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. Even the court reporter paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over her machine. Judge Wilson's expression remained neutral, but those who knew her well could see the slight tightening around her eyes. In 15 years on the bench, she had dealt with all kinds of defendants, scared teenagers, hardened criminals, desperate parents, but few had shown the level of entitlement that Thornton displayed. "Mr. Thornton, this court operates on its own schedule, not yours," she said, "and while we're discussing time, let's talk about your driving record." She held up a file. 3 speeding tickets in the past year. 2 incidents of parking in handicapped spaces. And now driving nearly twice the speed limit in a business district, resulting in significant property damage that has affected multiple lives. Thornton rolled his eyes and whispered something to his lawyer. The lawyer winced and tried to quiet his client. "Something you'd like to share with the court, Mr. Thornton?" Judge Wilson asked. "I said," Thornton replied loudly, "that I could buy and sell that dump 10 times over. It's just a greasy spoon. Let's talk settlement and be done with it." A gasp came from the gallery where Lou sat. The old man's face fell, decades of pride in his small business dismissed in a single cruel comment. Judge Wilson set down her pen. For a long moment, she simply looked at Thornton, taking in the expensive suit, the manicured hands, the utter lack of awareness of how his actions affected others. In that moment, she saw not just a reckless driver, but a pattern of behavior that would continue unless something changed. "Mr. Thornton," she said finally, "I think we need to discuss more than just monetary damages here. Much more." The tension in the courtroom grew thicker as Judge Wilson reviewed the case file. The only sounds were the occasional shuffle of papers and the nervous tapping of Thornton's lawyer's foot against the floor. "Mr. Thornton," Judge Wilson began, her voice carrying throughout the now silent courtroom, "do you understand the charges against you today?" Thornton shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Yeah, whatever. Driving too fast, hit a building. Like I said, I'll pay for it." Judge Wilson paused, her pen hovering over her notepad. "For the record, Mr. Thornton, I need a clear yes or no response. Do you understand the charges of reckless driving resulting in property damage?" Thornton rolled his eyes. "Yes," he mumbled. "I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you," Judge Wilson said. "Please speak clearly for the record." "Yes," Thornton said louder, the single word dripping with annoyance. His lawyer, Walsh, nudged him gently with an elbow, a silent plea to show respect. Thornton ignored him. "Thank you," Judge Wilson continued. Now, the prosecution has provided evidence including traffic camera footage showing your vehicle traveling at 62 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone before colliding with Lou's Diner. Do you dispute this evidence? Walsh quickly stood up. Your Honor, if I may, we'd like to present some mitigating circumstances. Mr. Thornton was responding to an urgent business matter and... An urgent business matter, Judge Wilson repeated, her tone neutral. More urgent than the safety of pedestrians on Main Street at noon on a Tuesday? Well, no, Your Honor, but... And this urgent business matter required Mr. Thornton to drive his Maserati at more than twice the legal speed limit through the busiest part of downtown. Walsh swallowed hard. We're prepared to accept responsibility, Your Honor, but we'd like to file a motion regarding the calibration of the traffic cameras. We have reason to believe... Oh, come on. Thornton suddenly burst out. This is ridiculous. It was just a fender bender. Nobody got hurt. The courtroom went still. Even the usual background noises, the scratch of the court reporter's machine, the rustle of papers, seemed to stop. Judge Wilson's gaze fixed on Thornton. Mr. Thornton, you will address this court with respect or face consequences for contempt. Do I make myself clear? Thornton's face flushed red. His lawyer frantically whispered in his ear, but Thornton shrugged him off. Mr. Thornton, Judge Wilson continued, you say nobody got hurt. But actions have consequences beyond physical injury. Ms. Chen, would you please stand? A young woman in the gallery stood up. She wore the uniform of Lou's Diner, a blue apron with a small name tag. Her face showed a mixture of nervousness and determination. Would you tell the court how the closure of Lou's Diner has affected you? Judge Wilson asked. The young woman cleared her throat. I'm putting myself through nursing school with my waitressing job. Without work for these past 3 weeks, I've had to drop one of my classes because I couldn't make the payment. That pushes my graduation back by a semester. Judge Wilson nodded. Thank you, Ms. Chen. You may sit down. She turned back to Thornton. That's one life affected by your fender bender, Mr. Thornton. So she has to wait a few more months to become a nurse. Big deal, Thornton muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Judge Wilson's face remained composed, but her voice took on a steely edge. Mr. Thornton, we will proceed methodically through this case. The court will hear all relevant testimony, review all evidence, and then determine appropriate penalties. This process takes time. Time I don't have, Thornton snapped. His patience visibly fraying, he checked his watch again and exhaled loudly. Look, can we just get to the fine already? How much do you want? 5,000? 10. Just tell me so I can get out of here. His lawyer's face had gone from worry to horrified. Your Honor, may I request a brief recess to confer with my client? In a moment, Mr. Walsh, Judge Wilson replied, her eyes still on Thornton. First, I want to make something very clear to Mr. Thornton. This is a court of law, not a marketplace. Justice is not for sale, and my rulings are not based on your schedule or convenience. Thornton's jaw clenched. The veins in his neck bulged as his face grew redder. Whatever thin thread had been holding his temper snapped. Just shut up and get this over with, he suddenly shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The words echoed through the stunned courtroom like a gunshot. For one long moment, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The silence that followed Thornton's outburst was so complete you could have heard a pin drop. Court officers stood frozen, their hands instinctively moving toward their belts. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her machine. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to pause its ticking. Judge Wilson didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her gavel. Instead, she placed her pen down with deliberate slowness and folded her hands on the bench before her. Her calm was more terrifying than any display of anger could have been. Bailiff, she said quietly, please take Mr. Thornton into custody. The bailiff moved forward immediately. Thornton's face transformed from anger to shock as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. Wait, what? You can't be serious, he sputtered as the bailiff approached. I didn't mean. You are held in contempt of court, Mr. Thornton, Judge Wilson interrupted, her voice still perfectly controlled. Bailiff, please escort the defendant to holding. Walsh, Thornton's lawyer, had gone pale. Your Honor, please, my client apologizes for his outburst. He's under considerable stress and— Mr. Walsh, Judge Wilson said, your client has shown consistent disrespect for this court, for the law, and for the people affected by his actions. The court will take a 30-minute recess. When we return, Mr. Thornton will have an opportunity to address his contempt charge. As the bailiff took Thornton by the arm, the reality of his situation finally seemed to hit him. The smirk vanished, replaced by genuine fear. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, his money, connections, and privilege weren't going to save him from consequences. You can't do this, he said, his voice now more pleading than demanding. Don't you know who I am? My father. Your father isn't here, Mr. Thornton, Judge Wilson replied. And in this courtroom, who you are or who you know makes no difference. As Thornton was led away, whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. Lou, the diner owner, sat in shocked silence. His granddaughter squeezed his hand. Did he really just tell her to shut up? Someone whispered loudly. Man's got a death wish, another replied. Judge Wilson stood. Court is in recess for 30 minutes. With a single tap of her gavel, she left the bench and disappeared through the door to her chambers. In the small holding cell behind the courtroom, reality crashed down on Thornton like a wave. The cold metal bench beneath him, the barred door, the bare walls, nothing like the luxury he was accustomed to. His expensive suit, which had always made him feel powerful, now seemed ridiculous in these surroundings. Outside the cell, he could hear his lawyer arguing desperately with the court officers. I need to speak with my client, Walsh insisted. Judge's orders. No visitors until she says so, came the firm reply. Alone with his thoughts for the first time in a long while, Thornton began to realize the gravity of his mistake. Judge Wilson wasn't some employee he could bully. She wasn't a contractor he could refuse to pay. She wasn't a city official he could charm or bribe. She was the law, and he had just told her to shut up in her own courtroom. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He thought about his father, whose connections had always smoothed the way for him. But his father was in Europe, unreachable for hours. This time, Thornton was on his own. Meanwhile, in her chambers, Judge Wilson sat quietly, reviewing Thornton's file more carefully. The pattern was clear, a lifetime of entitlement, of rules bent or broken, of consequences avoided. His behavior today wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the predictable outcome of a life lived without accountability. The bailiff knocked softly on her door. Your Honor. Mr. Thornton's lawyer would like a word. Send him in, she replied. Walsh entered, his tie loosened and forehead damp with perspiration. Your Honor, I want to express my deepest apologies for my client's behavior. It was inexcusable, and he knows that. Judge Wilson looked at him skeptically. Does he? I wonder, Mr. Walsh. Has Mr. Thornton ever truly faced consequences for his actions? Walsh hesitated, his silence more revealing than any answer could have been. That's what I thought, Judge Wilson said. She closed the file and stood up. Mr. Walsh, I've seen many people come through my courtroom over the years. Some are there because of one bad choice. Others are there because they've never learned that choices have consequences. She walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. The question now is how to ensure Mr. Thornton finally learns that lesson. 30 minutes felt like 30 hours to Thornton. By the time the bailiff came to escort him back to the courtroom, his expensive shirt was damp with sweat and his normally perfect hair hung limply over his forehead. Gone was the swagger that had carried him through life. In its place was something unfamiliar to him, genuine fear. Stand up straight, his lawyer whispered urgently as Thornton was led back in. Look respectful. And for God's sake, don't say anything unless the judge asks you a direct question. The courtroom had filled even more during the recess. Word had spread quickly about the rich developer who had told Judge Wilson to shut up. Court watchers, law students, and even a few reporters now packed the back rows. Thornton felt their eyes on him as he walked to the defendant's table, and for once in his life, he wanted to disappear. All rise, called the bailiff as Judge Wilson returned to the bench. She moved with the same calm dignity as before, showing no sign that Thornton's outburst had affected her at all. Be seated, she said, arranging her papers. We will now address the contempt charge against Mr. Thornton before returning to the original case. She looked directly at Thornton, her gaze neither angry nor vindictive, but clear-eyed and evaluating. Mr. Thornton, do you understand why you are being held in contempt of court? Thornton's lawyer nudged him. He cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Please speak up for the record, Judge Wilson said. Yes, Your Honor, he repeated, louder this time. And would you like to address the court regarding your behavior? This was his chance. Walsh had coached him during the brief moments they'd had together. Apologize sincerely, show remorse, beg for mercy if necessary. Thornton straightened his shoulders slightly. Your Honor, he began, then faltered. The prepared speech his lawyer had suggested felt hollow even to him. I lost my temper. I was frustrated with the process and I spoke disrespectfully. He paused, struggling to find words that didn't sound rehearsed. I'm sorry, he finally added, and for perhaps the first time he meant it. Judge Wilson studied him for a long moment. Mr. Thornton, contempt of court is a serious matter. It undermines the judicial process and the rule of law that protects everyone in this society, including you. Thornton nodded, eyes downcast. However, she continued, I am less concerned with your momentary outburst than with the pattern of behavior it represents. She opened a folder on her bench. This is your third appearance in my courtroom. Each time, you have shown increasing disregard for the process, for the people affected by your actions, and for the consequences of those actions. She looked out at the courtroom. The law is not just about punishment, it's about justice. And sometimes, justice requires more than a fine that means nothing to someone of your financial means. Thornton shifted uncomfortably. What was she getting at? Before I rule on both the contempt charge and the original case, I'd like to hear from someone else. Judge Wilson looked toward the gallery. Mr. Liu Wan, would you please come forward? The elderly diner owner looked surprised but stood up slowly. His granddaughter helped him to the front of the courtroom where he stood, back straight despite his years, facing the judge. Mr. Wan, you've owned Liu's Diner for how long? Judge Wilson asked. 37 years next month, Your Honor, he replied in a soft but clear voice. And can you tell the court what that diner means to the community? Liu looked at Thornton for the first time, not with anger, but with a kind of sadness. We serve breakfast to the hospital workers getting off night shift. We host the high school debate team meetings every Thursday. We've been the first job for dozens of kids saving for college. His voice grew stronger as he spoke. When the big storm hit 3 years back, we stayed open, cooking on gas stoves to feed the emergency workers. That diner isn't just my business. It's where life happens in our neighborhood. The courtroom was silent. Even Thornton couldn't look away as the old man spoke with quiet dignity about a life built through decades of hard work, work that had been interrupted by a moment of Thornton's recklessness. Thank you, Mr. Wan, Judge Wilson said. You may return to your seat. She turned her attention back to Thornton, who'd for once appeared to be truly listening. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Wilson gathered her thoughts. She looked down at her notes one last time, then set her pen aside. Everyone could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't going to be a routine ruling. Mr. Thornton, she began, her voice firm but not harsh, I've considered both the reckless driving charge and the contempt of court charge carefully. The maximum fine for your driving offense is $5,000 with an additional $1,000 for contempt. For someone of your financial means, these amounts are insignificant, the equivalent of pocket change. Thornton's lawyer nodded eagerly, already reaching for his client's checkbook. This was going exactly as they'd hoped, a fine they could pay on the spot and be done with it. However, Judge Wilson continued, and that single word caused Walsh's hand to freeze mid-motion. I don't believe such a penalty would serve justice in this case. She stood up, something she rarely did during sentencing. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration. It's about making things right, not just with money, but with meaningful action. Thornton's pulse quickened. What was she talking about? Mr. Thornton, I've reviewed your business holdings as part of this case. Your company, Thornton Development, owns several properties in the Pine Hills neighborhood. Is that correct? Thornton looked confused by this turn, but nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The same Pine Hills neighborhood where the waste management facility operated by your subsidiary was cited last year for improper chemical disposal affecting groundwater in the area? Thornton shifted uncomfortably. That had been handled quietly with a small fine and a promise to clean things up, eventually. How did she know about that? Yes, Your Honor, he admitted. The same neighborhood where residents have filed multiple complaints about respiratory issues since that incident. Thornton's lawyer jumped in. Your Honor, those allegations haven't been proven, and they're not relevant to today's case. On the contrary, Mr. Walsh, Judge Wilson replied. They speak directly to a pattern of behavior by your client, a pattern of disregard for how his actions affect others, particularly those with less power and influence than himself. She turned her attention back to Thornton. Here is my ruling. For the reckless driving charge and the contempt charge combined, you will complete 200 hours of community service. Thornton visibly relaxed. Community service wasn't ideal, but it was better than jail time. His lawyer could probably get it reduced later. This service, Judge Wilson continued, will be performed specifically at the Pine Hills Community Restoration Project, working to clean up the environmental damage caused by your company's facility. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. This wasn't a standard sentence. Furthermore, Judge Wilson held up her hand for silence. You will work directly alongside the residents affected by the contamination. You will report to Mrs. Gloria Patterson, who chairs the Neighborhood Association and has been fighting for clean water for her community for over a year. Thornton's mouth fell open. Gloria Patterson, the same woman who had confronted him at a city council meeting, the one his PR team had dismissed as a troublemaker. Your Honor, this is highly unusual, Walsh protested. My client is a busy executive. Perhaps we could arrange for him to fund the cleanup instead. Judge Wilson's expression didn't change. Mr. Walsh, that's precisely the problem. Mr. Thornton believes every problem can be solved by throwing money at it. But some lessons can only be learned through direct experience. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Thornton, you will report to the Pine Hills Community Center at 8 a.m. this Saturday to begin your service. You will work every weekend for as long as it takes to complete your 200 hours. You will wear appropriate work clothes, not business attire. You will take direction from Mrs. Patterson without complaint. She let that sink in before continuing. Additionally, Lou's Diner will be fully restored at your expense, and all employees will receive back pay for the time the business has been closed. Thornton stared, unable to believe what he was hearing. Finally, Judge Wilson said, "This court will maintain jurisdiction over this case. You will appear before me monthly to report on your progress. Any failure to complete your service hours as directed will result in immediate jail time. Is that understood?" That first Saturday morning arrived too quickly for Thornton. He parked his luxury car 3 blocks from the Pine Hills Community Center, embarrassed to be seen in it. Dressed in the only pair of jeans he owned and a plain t-shirt bought the night before, he walked up to the worn brick building with a knot in his stomach. A group of about 20 people were already gathered outside, holding shovels, rakes, and work gloves. They fell silent as he approached. At the center stood a tall black woman in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, clipboard in hand. "You must be Mr. Thornton," she said, looking him up and down. "I'm Gloria Patterson." "Yes, ma'am," Thornton replied, the words feeling strange in his mouth. When was the last time he had called anyone ma'am? "You're 10 minutes late," Gloria noted. "We start at 8, not 8:10. That's 10 minutes you'll need to make up." She handed him a pair of work gloves. "Today, we're clearing the empty lot behind the elementary school. It's been contaminated with runoff from your facility, and we're preparing it for soil testing." Over the next several weekends, Thornton learned what real work felt like. His soft hands blistered and then calloused. His unused muscles ached. He sweated through his shirts within an hour each day. But something else happened too. He began to listen. He listened as Mr. Henderson, a retired plumber, explained how his grandchildren couldn't play in their own backyard anymore because of the contaminated soil. He listened as Mrs. Washington, a third-grade teacher, described how many of her students used inhalers since the water quality declined. He listened as Gloria shared how she'd been writing letters to his company for 18 months without receiving a single meaningful response. "Your secretary sent us a form letter," she told him one day as they took a water break. "Said our concerns were being taken under advisement. What does that even mean?" Thornton had no answer. He knew exactly what it meant. nothing was being done. By his fourth weekend, something shifted. Rather than counting down his hours, Thornton began asking questions. "What if we installed a filtration system for the school?" he asked Gloria, "and tested all the homes within a 5-block radius?" Gloria studied him carefully. "You could have done that a year ago." "I know," he admitted. "I should have." When Judge Wilson held the first monthly review, she didn't recognize the man who stood before her. Gone was the expensive suit, replaced by clean but casual clothes. Gone was the arrogant posture, replaced by a respectful attentiveness. "Your Honor," Thornton began, "I'd like to report on my progress, but also propose some additional measures." She nodded for him to continue. "Besides the hours I've worked, I've established a remediation fund for Pine Hills," he explained. "It's not just to clean up the current contamination, but to convert our facility to meet higher environmental standards than the law requires." Judge Wilson raised an eyebrow. "This is separate from your court-ordered service?" "Yes, Your Honor, this is something I'm choosing to do." Behind him in the gallery, Gloria Patterson nodded with cautious approval. Over the following months, Lou's Diner reopened with new equipment and a renovated dining area. The Pine Hills Community Center received funding for an environmental health clinic. Thornton's company established a scholarship program for local students pursuing environmental science degrees. On the day Thornton completed his 200th hour of service, the community held a small gathering. There was no grand ceremony, no press release, just shared food and conversation. "You know," Gloria said as she handed him a piece of homemade pie, "when you first showed up here, I gave you 2 weeks before you try to buy your way out." Thornton smiled slightly. "I probably would have before. What changed your mind?" "The day you brought your father here," Gloria replied. "When you showed him what his company had been doing all these years." That had been a turning point for Thornton too, watching his father's face as he realized the human cost of their business practices. The following week, at Thornton's final court appearance, Judge Wilson reviewed his completion report. "Mr. Thornton," she said, "it appears you fulfilled all requirements of your sentence." "Thank you, Your Honor," he replied. "Is there anything you'd like to say before we close this case?" Thornton looked at her thoughtfully. "Just, thank you, for not taking the easy way out." Judge Wilson allowed herself a small smile. "Justice isn't about punishment, Mr. Thornton, it's about restoration." As Thornton turned to leave, Judge Wilson added, "And Mr. Thornton, the next time you appear in my courtroom, I expect it will be because you're helping someone else find their way."